America. Good morning to our listeners in Asia. I'm Sigrid Schmalzer, professor of history at UMass Amherst. It is my honor to welcome you to tonight's Feinberg series panel, U.S. Empire in Asia and the Pacific. You've just been listening to Talk Story by Blue Scholars, a hip hop duo out of Seattle that raps about U.S. imperialism. We'll be playing more music selections at the end of the event, so do please stay tuned. We are broadcasting from the campus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community, and made possible through the Morrill Land Grant Act, which sold portions of land from 82 Native nations to fund the building of land-grant universities, including UMass Amherst. We begin with this acknowledgement. This event is presented by the Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series, offered every other year by the Department of History at UMass Amherst. Each Feinberg series focuses on a big issue with deep historical roots and profound relevance to the present. Titled Confronting Empire, this year's series is exploring global histories of US imperialism and anti-imperialist resistance. This series covers a vast history of US empire, from its roots as a settler colonial state to overseas expansion to the wars of the 21st century. I encourage you to visit the Feinberg series website to learn more. There you can also view recordings of past events and register for future events, including the next event on November 15th, which is the inaugural Daniel Ellsberg Lecture delivered by the 2022 Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Azmat Khan on the human toll of America's air wars. You can find more information about these offerings in the chat box, along with information on how to turn on live closed captioning and how to listen to tonight's event in Spanish. If you are attending this event as part of a class, you'll also want to look to the chat box for a link to our sign-in sheet. After the presentations, we are looking forward to a lively Q&A session. We will periodically drop a link into the Q&A form, or a link to the Q&A form into the chat box. So as you listen to the presentations, please do feel free to use that form to submit your question. You don't need to wait until the end to submit. Please submit it when you think of it, and we will assemble the questions backstage as we prepare for the Q&A. Before we begin, I'd also like to thank the more than 36 university and community partners who collaborated with the UMass Amherst History Department to co-present this series. In particular, the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy, the 5-college Asian Pacific American Studies program, and the Critical China Scholars. I also thank the large team of students, faculty, and staff whose collaborative efforts brought this series to fruition, and Kenneth R. Feinberg and Associates, whose generosity made this series possible. Tonight's event brings our attention to the ongoing effects of US empire in Asia and the Pacific. Between 1893 and 1902, the US forcefully annexed Hawaii and the Philippines and participated in the brutal suppression of the anti-imperialist Boxer Uprising in China. Since that time, the Asia-Pacific region has been a major site for the development and maintenance of US empire, a history rooted in racism that continues to have profound consequences for people in Asia, the Pacific, and the US today. US empire has intersected over time with multiple other empires, including Spanish, Japanese, and Chinese empires, along with nationalist state building and revolutionary movements. The panelists will show that despite the oft-repeated goal of promoting democracy, US empire has consistently produced state repression, violence, and even fascism. It is now my honor to introduce our first panelist. Moonho Jung is professor of history at the University of Washington, where he teaches courses on race, politics, and Asian American history. His most recent book, which forms the basis of his remarks today, is Menace to Empire, Anti-Colonial Solidarities and the Trans-Pacific Origins of the U.S. Security State. Please join me in welcoming him now. And as you listen to his talk, please do remember to click the link found in the chat box to submit any questions through the Q&A form.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me okay? All right, greetings from Seattle. Thank you for having us. And I am so happy to be a part of this conversation on the US empire, because as far as I'm concerned, we can't talk about the US empire enough. I'd like to begin with 2 sentences from my recent book that I really like. Yes, I am so smart that I feel compelled to quote myself. The 2 sentences are: to point out the obvious, a democracy rooted in empire and white supremacy is not democracy. That's American democracy. From there, we can begin to approach the United States not as a multicultural nation that welcomes and embraces diversity, but as an empire rooted in white supremacy from its founding to today. We can then begin to see how anti-Asian racism is not an aberration or an exception in US history. Rather, anti-Asian racism has been a fundamental element in the making of the United States as a nation and as an empire. In that light, the liberal hope of being recognized as full-fledged Americans is beyond an impossibility for Asian Americans. It is, in fact, a misguided hope that ultimately feeds the racial and colonial order called the United States of America. Let me elaborate. To point out the obvious again, empire and democracy cannot coexist. If the United States is anything, it was and is an empire that has claimed unilateral authority over lands and peoples, and in recent decades has claimed the authority to incarcerate or kill basically anyone around the world, all in the name of freedom and democracy, of course. To me, that is the US empire in a nutshell. It was in that historical project of white supremacy and empire that laws against sedition proliferated in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Historically, those who have been condemned and criminalized as seditious in US history were those struggling against white supremacy and empire. I could go way back in time, but let me begin with the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century. In 1898, when Spain and the United States went to war, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, decided to launch an attack on Manila in the Spanish colony of the Philippines. Spanish forces, reeling from 2 years of fighting against Filipino revolutionaries, surrendered to US forces. And in December of 1898, the United States agreed to purchase, that is to colonize, the Philippines for $20 million. Filipinos who at one time thought that the United States could be an ally against the Spanish refused to submit to a new colonial master. And in 1899, the bloody Philippine-American War began, in which hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were killed. No matter how many Filipinos US forces killed, or because of the high death toll, those struggling for Philippine independence refused to surrender. To control the unruly masses, the US-Philippine Commission passed in 1901 a law that they called the Sedition Act. The law prohibited, quote, any person to advocate orally or by writing or printing or by like methods the independence of the Philippine Islands or their separation from the United States, either by peaceful or forcible means. That law to me is critical to understanding the logic and rhetoric of race and empire. Defining sedition or defining who is disloyal or un-American or anti-American has everything to do with empire. Sedition is a legal and political category that has been about securing empire. And defining sedition has also everything to do with race. Filipinos contesting the US empire were racialized with the N-word and gugus and the like, making them fit only for mass annihilation or colonial tutelage. That was why Filipinos were deemed seditious. Now, those ideas of sedition, loyalty, and disloyalty would proliferate over the course of the 20th century to mark anyone engaged in struggles against race and empire as seditious. Anyone who dared to confront and challenge white supremacy and the US empire has been marked historically as disloyal, un-American, communist, gook, and so forth. Sedition in turn would be inscribed in US immigration law to categorize anti-colonial activities as crimes against the nation. And race naturalized that connection between sedition and immigration to secure the US empire. Although the US Constitution enumerated no explicit authority on immigration controls, laws and legal cases on Chinese exclusion in the 19th century had conferred the federal government with unilateral and exclusive power in all matters related to immigration and deportation. It was the beginning of a legal and political discourse that fundamentally linked immigration laws to national security, a link that persists to this day. In a critical phrase in the Chinese exclusion case of 1889, the US Supreme Court ruled, quote, to preserve its independence and give security against foreign aggression and encroachment is the highest duty of every nation, whether from this foreign nation acting in its national character or from vast hordes of its people crowding in upon us. The government possessing the powers which are to be exercised for protection and security is clothed with authority to determine the occasion on which the powers shall be called forth. If the US government categorized foreigners of a different race as dangerous to its peace and security, the court reasoned, its designation and exclusion could not be stayed because at the time there are no actual hostilities with that nation of which the foreigners are subjects. That is how national security has been defined ever since. That is, if the US government deemed you a threat, you were a threat. And race marked the Chinese and other Asians as a threat to US national security. Now, let me move forward in time a little bit. In the first half of the 20th century, the US state, through intelligence networks, military campaigns, and immigration agents, marked Asians as seditious threats, in part because of their anti-colonial and revolutionary aspirations. And those aspirations came to be linked not only to anarchism and communism, but to imperial Japan. Deflecting and projecting anti-colonial activities against the US empire onto imperial Japan in the process made the US empire seemingly defensible. In November of 1907, the Military Intelligence Division, or the MID, authored one of the very earliest global surveys of US national security interests. It dwelled on threats supposedly posed by Asians and Japan. Completely disregarding Filipino grievances against US colonial rule, the report fixated on Japan's racial and imperial ambitions. It stated, quote, Japan has for many years desired to unite the people of Asia with herself as the dominant and controlling power. She believes that she has a heaven-sent mission to control the affairs of the extreme Orient, and all her efforts have been directed to this end for a long time back, unquote. Many anti-colonial revolutionaries in Asia and around the world indeed took inspiration from Japan, often romanticizing Japan as a role model against the West. A revolutionary newspaper in the Philippines argued in 1908, for example, quote, Filipinos, we do not want Japan as a ruler. Nevertheless, we want her as a leader, as a redeemer, as a guide, as a breath to the existence of the nations of the Orient and of a people gathered under the same name and united by ties of blood. Rather than listening to Filipinos' demands, US officials looked for signs of imperial Japan at work. One official responded to that particular editorial by writing, quote, I have no proof, but I am convinced that the Japanese government owns or at least controls that paper. As Filipino workers moved to Hawaii and North America in the 1910s and 1920s, so did the US security state. Both Filipino workers and agents of the US security state carried with them histories and memories of what had preceded them. And wherever the Japanese and Filipinos converged, physically, ideologically, symbolically, and otherwise, agents of the US state came to see a pan-Asian conspiracy to undermine and overthrow the US empire. When Hawaii sugar planters faced a massive strike by Japanese plantation workers in 1909, they began recruiting Filipino workers en masse. Within a span of 10 years, Filipino workers went from 0.3% of the plantation labor force to about 25%. But that movement created new anxieties, new fears. In 1920, Japanese and Filipino workers both went out on strike, the MID interpreted the strike as something more insidious, something bigger. The MID agent in Hawaii reported, quote, "This may be a case of labor against capital, but it sounds more like a declaration of final racial allegiance. It is a reflection of pan-Asianism," unquote. Over time, the agent grew more certain of its pan-Asian foundation. He concluded, quote, "The Japanese government is behind this movement in order to weld together and to whip up into line the Oriental population of this territory in the furtherance of its pan-Asian policies. We have, in other words, a powerful, potential, and masked enemy in our midst," unquote. Japanese workers, in response, tried to counter such reports by stating again and again, quote, "We have no official connection, not even a backstairs connection, with the Japanese government or any of its officials, whether resident in Japan or in Hawaii," unquote. But the racial and counter-revolutionary narrative of US national security ran too deep. 3 months after the conclusion of the 1920 labor strike, the MID officer in Honolulu decided to write a comprehensive report on the Japanese situation in Hawaii and around the world. The agent argued, quote, "Japan is firmly based in Formosa, close to the Philippines. She has, by her propaganda in the Philippines, rendered possible insurrections on a smaller scale. She is undoubtedly plotting with the Germans in Mexico. She controls the lanes of the Pacific from Hawaii to the Orient. She has extended her espionage net from the Puget Sound to Panama." The agent's apocalyptic vision went on, so much that his superiors noted that his report was, quote, "a peculiar paper for an official document. It reads more like a piece of propaganda." But his report was merely an uncensored version of intelligence reports emanating from the Philippines from at least 1907. Concentrating on the Japanese problem not only enabled the great expansion of the US security state, but also served to elide the ultimate source behind labor and political struggles in the Philippines and in Hawaii, the US empire. Let me move forward in time some more. About 80 years ago, during a turbulent time when anti-Asian violence and war threats mounted, individuals felt compelled to choose sides. Carl Yoneda, a Japanese American who had gravitated to communism because of the movement's efforts to organize workers of color, including Asian workers, and to take a decisive stand against colonialism, felt that he had to make a choice. Despite being arrested by the FBI shortly after Pearl Harbor, Yoneda vowed to support the United States and the war effort, quote, "to help smash Japan's fascist imperialists for democracy." The Communist Party of the United States of America kicked Japanese Americans, including Yoneda, out of the party. Even though the binding links between white supremacy and US nationalism led to that decision, Yoneda continued to identify with American democracy against fascist Japan. He became a voluntary informant for the FBI to report on pro-Japanese Japanese Americans. But the FBI continued to monitor Yoneda's subversive activities in America's concentration camps during World War II. On the other side of the Pacific, Artemio Ricarte had worked for decades to make the Philippines independent. He repeatedly refused to pledge allegiance to the United States. And for his refusal, he was arrested and exiled. He lived in exile in Japan, hoping to find support for Philippine independence in Japan. Shortly after the Japanese forces occupied the Philippines during World War II, Ricarte agreed to return home aboard a Japanese military plane. When he landed in the Philippines, the 75-year-old Ricarte raised the Japanese flag and delivered a speech advising Filipinos to cooperate with their Japanese liberators. In the throes of war, Yoneda and Ricarte believed that they had to decide Japan or the United States. But the fundamental contradiction was never between the United States and Japan. It was between empire and democracy. And in their seemingly opposing positions during World War II, both Yoneda, who supported the United States, and Ricarte, who supported Japan, ended up serving empire. As we attempt to confront and understand anti-Asian racism and the US empire, today, I suggest that we take that historical lesson into account. It will be tempting. It will be so tempting to claim our Americanness. At the same time, whatever we might say, we will be marked as un-American or anti-American. But we can't be misled by those labels. We can exploit those labels, maybe use them ironically if we must, but we can't be led to believe that American democracy is real democracy. We should be against empire, including and perhaps especially the US empire, and against anti-Asian racism at the heart of that empire. But we also can't be deluded into thinking that siding with Asia, whatever that represents, is somehow inherently against empire. There are no easy answers, but I know this much. In the struggle for justice and democracy, we cannot but be a menace to empire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jung, for your very insightful analysis. We will now turn to our second panelist. Nerissa Balce is a professor of Asian American Studies at SUNY Stony Brook. She is the author of Body Parts of Empire, Visual Abjection, Filipino Images, and the American Archive. She will also be drawing on her new book project on the Philippine state through photography and fiction. Please join me in welcoming her, and please do remember to submit any questions through that Q&A form. The link will be reposted in the chat box.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. Before I start my talk, I wanted to thank the organizers of this event, particularly UMass Amherst professors Richard Chu and Sigrid Schmalzer. The University of Massachusetts is very special to me since this is where I started my work on empire and the Filipino savage. So I'll be reading parts of an essay that was published in a new anthology entitled Philippinex, American Studies, Reckoning, Reclamation, and Transformation. And so if I can call Tom to put on the slides, please. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we'll start with just that. So let's move to the second slide, Tom. Thank you. I want to start with a quote from the Filipino-American novelist Gina Apostol, winner of the 2022 Rome Prize for Literature. In the recent Filipino-American International Book Festival held in San Francisco, Apostol read these words to a crowd of Filipino-American book lovers, writers, scholars, and community members. And this is a quote from Apostol. I have been unable to find contemporary accounts by Filipinos of the Philippine-American War. It's told mainly through American soldiers, teachers, government officials. The voice of this war is the voice of the enemy. What I have understood is that our silence or forgetting of our war against the Americans is structural, cultural destruction. It is not amnesia. It is not a disease on our part. It is an aspect of genocide. Forgetting is an aspect of genocide, end quote. Taking a page from Gina Apostol, my talk today wrestles with forgetting. by connecting the histories of the US empire and the rise of Filipino fascist dictators. If the official or historical accounts of the Philippine-American War are not ours, but the US colonizers, then I turn to images and texts to tell a different story of empire. My brief talk today is on two themes. First, the violence of the American empire continues under other names such as the US security state or American global power. And we heard some of this from the brilliant presentation of Professor Jung. And my second point, or the second theme of this talk, is that fascists like the former Philippine President Rodrigo Roa Duterte and the current Philippine President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. and Vice President Sara Duterte are extensions of the American empire. Filipino dictators and their cronies are loyal sons and daughters of the American empire, not out of a shared ideological belief, but out of their own pure ambition and desire for power. Their anti-left regimes are supported by the US or the United States. I propose a radical Filipina feminist imagination, a way of seeing and understanding Filipino images and literary texts, referencing the violence of empire and fascism. So for the remainder of my time tonight, I will discuss two texts. First, scenes from the novel Insurrecto, and that's the cover of the novel by Apostol. And lastly, the documentary Call Her Ganda, which was distributed in 2018 and directed by the Filipino-American filmmaker P.J. Raval. The term ganda means beauty and is the nickname of the transgender Filipina Jennifer Laude, the subject of Raval's film. Beyond images of Philippine state violence, corruption, and government cruelty, I want to consider what is beyond these images of atrocity. I will conclude with images as artifacts, Filipino images as artifacts of insurrection and beauty. For my last section, I will discuss the work of Malaya, New York, and Malaya in Filipino means free or freedom. And this is an organization that I'm part of. Next slide, please. So a care warning on this slide and some future, the next few slides. We start off by acknowledging that because the history of the American empire is violent, then images left behind or from that history are violent as well. I wanted to reference the work of cultural studies critic Dylan Rodriguez, who writes that the violent American colonization of the Philippines after the Philippine-American War was a historical moment of what he terms as, quote, white supremacist statecraft, defined by genocide as an American nation-building project. The Filipino condition, as Rodriguez refers to Filipino immigrant life in the US, is intimately tied to a war of conquest that remains unrecognized and forgotten. And this is the reason why when we see this postcard, most Filipinos and Americans might not recognize that this is from the Philippine-American War. Proof of the forgotten status of the war is this postcard, which I've discussed in my 2016 book, Body Parts of Empire. This postcard shows the Budajo massacre of 1906, taken 4 years after the official end of the Philippine-American War in 1902. And I found the postcard in Manila, collected by a retired New Yorker named Mario Fair. The original photograph taken by an unknown American photographer was censored for decades and was published in 1939 in the memoir of a white journalist, Oswald Garrison Villard, a founder of the Anti-Imperialist League and the NAACP. Our historical entanglement, I mean our meaning Filipino-American historical entanglement with the American empire, explains our invisibility and visibility in American culture. As media scholar Sarita Chavez C. put it, she says, quote, Filipino America owes its existence to the monumentally violent and monumentally forgotten inclusion of the Philippines into the United States more than a century ago, when the Philippine-American War broke out in 1899. Next slide, please. Another cultural studies critic, Nefertiti Diar, discussed empire as, quote, the rule of global war. And she describes the rise of fascism as the current form of the American empire. Tadiar writes that after the US bombing of Afghanistan in 2001, the new form of the American empire is global fascism. She writes that, quote, the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war against crime, the war against poverty, these are all examples of, quote, the absolute and arbitrary rule of US empire. If in the 19th century, the American empire waged war with American soldiers and Gatling guns, in the 20th and 21st century, empire is waged through war, economic sanctions, domestic and foreign policies to maintain and to preserve American global power. After the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the rise of decolonizing nationalist movements around the world, what followed in the global South were anti-left, anti-communist counterinsurgency campaigns funded by the US military-industrial complex. And now I want to again give a care warning, and we're moving to the next slide that will have violent images. Tom, please. Thank you. I want to pause here for a care warning and to make explicit the links between the history of US-funded counterinsurgencies and the rise of anti-communist dictators in the Philippines. On the left side of the slide, we see images of anti-communist death squads, and they existed during, they operated during the first Marcos regime. And the photograph on the lower part of the slide, I tried to manipulate so you wouldn't see the full horror of the photograph. But these are two members of an anti-communist paramilitary group that cut off the head of a suspected communist. And then the image on the other side of the slide is Sara Duterte, who was quoted saying to the Philippine police that they should show no mercy to those who threaten peace and order. State terror, in particular, the harassment, arrest, torture, and disappearance of leftist government critics, student leaders, labor leaders, journalists, farmers, etc., were a component of the Marcos regime then and now. As historian Joy Salas wrote, Filipino fascists like Marcos, Duterte, and now Marcos Jr. are Cold War warriors, anti-communists supported by the United States government. Ferdinand Marcos signed mutual defense acts for the US bases to operate in the Philippines. He received military assistance for his, essentially his private army, the Philippine military, and the Marcos government supported the US war against North Vietnam, despite the opposition of the Philippine Congress. Similarly, in 2016, Duterte accepted $127 million in US military aid, including $32 million for his police-sponsored extrajudicial killings operating through what he called a drug war. But as we know, it isn't a drug war at all. Our US tax dollars have always been used to support violent and corrupt Filipino governments because fascist repression of the Philippine left secures American global power in the Asia Pacific. But we can do something about this, which I will discuss in my conclusion. The next slide, please. Since the rise of Duterte after May 2016, since his rise as a leader, a fascist leader, there have been many forms of state-sanctioned violence, disappearances, torture, and extrajudicial killings committed by the Philippine police or paramilitaries. So it really is an echo of the Marcos regime. More than 30,000 Filipinos, mostly from the slums of the country, have been killed by Duterte's so-called drug war. The drug killings are considered by some scholars as a genocide of the poor, but also, as Nefertiti Diar has noted, it is also an extension of the brutal US-led counterinsurgency, military and paramilitary campaigns conducted by the American military's war against socialism and communism. Next slide, please. Now, this last part of my talk focuses on insurrection and beauty in Filipino-American art as the afterlives of empire. And by art, I mean a historical satirical novel and a documentary film. A literary text that connects the histories of US military occupation to the regime of a Filipino fascist is the novel Insurrecto by novelist Gina Apostol. The novel's title refers to the figure of the Filipino as an insurgent, the unruly and unassimilable colonial subject. It also references the various interruptions in the novel as it narrates the history of the American empire in Asia. In Apostol's novel, the colonial past and the fascist present under the Duterte regime are interconnected with the traumas of empire inscribed on different bodies, places, and objects. Insurrecto narrates the travels of an American filmmaker named Chiara, who goes to the Philippines to make a movie about the Philippine-American War. And a Filipina immigrant scholar from New York travels with Chiara. Her name is Magsalin, and her name literally means to translate. When Chiara and Magsalin travel to Duterte's Philippines, they clash and compete to tell the story of empire through different film scripts. Chiara's story of a white female photographer and Magsalin's story of a Filipina school teacher. Before their trip to Samar province, Chiara gives Magsalin an envelope of stereo cards from the Philippine-American War. And she says, this is a quote from the novel, "The pictures of the dead Filipino bodies and the burned Filipino towns are remarkably precise, but they are hard to see," end quote. Insurrecto is a novel about what is hard to see. That is, the historic connections of empire, war, and fascism. Ironic and satirical, Insurrecto is a novel about the legacies of empire as told through the intersecting lives of women in different periods. As the immigrant translator, Magsalin asks, and this is a quote from the novel of Gina Apostol, "The question, it seems to me, is how to keep the past from recurring. I mean, what the fuck is the point of knowing history's goddamn repetitive spirals if we remain its bloody victims?" Another narrative on the afterlives of empire is the documentary Call Her Ganda, directed by the Filipino-American filmmaker P.J. Raval. The film centers on the brutal murder of a transgender Filipina named Jennifer Ganda Laude, and we see the image of Jennifer in the cover of the poster for the film. Ganda is the nickname of Jennifer, and it was given by her mother. And in Filipino, Ganda means beauty. Jennifer was brutally murdered by a 19-year-old American Marine named Joseph Pemberton while he was on holiday in the port city of Olongapo, Philippines. Jennifer's murder and the pardon granted by Duterte's administration to Pemberton in 2020 connects the history of empire with Filipino fascism. Though the documentary was filmed before Duterte took office, the film is in fact a prologue, a fascist prologue, a beginning of Filipino life in Duterte's violent republic. Towards the end of the film, the documentary includes images of Duterte and a corpse on the streets of Manila, representing the tens of thousands of Filipinos killed in the ongoing drug war. Raval's film presents the ugly history of Philippine-American relations. Filipino lives are violable, and white American lives are sacred. Despite the heartbreaking conclusion of Jennifer Laude's case, Ganda or Beauty's story is also a story of desire for justice, hope, and futurity. In the documentary, we see crowds of Filipinos in protest rallies for transgender rights and for abolishing the military agreements between the US and the Philippines. Beauty is also the life of Jennifer, and it is her name, a young woman who loved her family, her friends, and had plans for a new life in Germany with her fiancé. but her young life was cut short by an American soldier. So in conclusion, this is my last image for this presentation. I wanted to end with images of insurrection and beauty. In May 2022, the fascists cheated and won in the Philippine elections. And if I can ask Tom to just switch to the last slide, please. Thank you. On September 20, on the first US visit of the Marcos Duterte administration to New York, community members marched in the streets of Manhattan, carrying images of victims of Marcos's martial law and Duterte's extrajudicial killings. I'll end by inviting you to join our resistance to empire and fascism. What can you do? Call your congressman, call your congressional representative to sign the Philippine Human Rights Act, calling for sanctions against the members of the previous Duterte government and the suspension of US military aid for the Philippine military and police. Join the boycott against the Asia Society in New York and support the 3 Filipinx activists, the Makibeki NYC3, who were arrested during the violent dispersal at the museum because the museum invited, surprise, surprise, Bongbong Marcos. Or please join Filipino community organizations such as Malaya Movement that I'm part of, or join Bayan USA, US Filipinos for Good Governance, Migrante USA, and Gabriela USA. I hope that this event will make you be interested in joining our beautiful insurrection against US empire and fascism, because rage driven by history is beautiful. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Balce, for that very enlightening talk. And I believe there will be links to the petitions and other actions that she asked you to consider participating in, put in the chat. I will now introduce our final panelist. Brian Hioe is joining us from Taiwan, where he was a participant in the 2014 Sunflower Student Movement, and he was one of the founding editors of New Bloom, an online magazine covering activism and youth politics. His analysis of Taiwan as caught between the 2 empires of the US and the People's Republic of China has been featured in New Bloom and also in The Guardian, in Democracy Now!, among other venues. Please welcome Brian Hioe, and please do remember to submit any questions you have for any of the panelists through the Q&A form, and we will be reposting that link again in the chat box.
Hey everybody, so I'm joining you all from Taiwan this morning for me, and so you might hear the sound of morning traffic in the background, but apologies for that. So I'm going to be talking first from contemporary events. Taiwan has historically been neglected. It's not been talked about a lot, but particularly in recent months, in recent weeks, it has suddenly taken on global significance. A recent visit to Taiwan by the US Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, was discussed as though it could be potentially a flashpoint for global conflict. International news media reported on this as though it could potentially be a trigger for World War III. Nothing happened, but in the aftermath of the visit, there were live fire drills held by China around Taiwan. These took place closer to Taiwan than during the third Taiwan Straits crisis, prompting some discussion of whether we were seeing another Taiwan Straits crisis, and China fired missiles that passed over Taipei as part of this drilling. But what happened in Taiwan during this time? In contrast to how much international media depicted things, people were relatively calm on the ground in Taiwan. People were not panicking, life went on as usual. But this was not how international media reported on it. And so during that time, as a journalist and activist, oftentimes I'd be taking interviews from media outlets being like, people are panicking in the streets, they're looking for shelters, aren't they? But that was not the case. People have had decades to be used to Chinese threats directed at Taiwan, but that is not picked up on international media coverage. And so I think, what does that tell us? It is that the perspectives of Taiwanese people have been ignored. Taiwan has had decades to become used to Chinese threats. In particular, we're discussing US empire today, and Taiwan has a very particular relation to US empire. Even now, what the US is Taiwan's security guarantor against the threat of Chinese invasion. But at the same time, its own stance on Taiwan is unofficially ambiguous. The US does not commit to defense of Taiwan, but it keeps Taiwan in this limbo of quote unquote strategic ambiguity. That is to say, making it unclear how it would react in the event of a Chinese invasion. As for China's own claims over Taiwan, that raises the question of, for example, non-US empire and non-Western empire that some of the other speakers have gestured towards, particularly with regards to the history of the Japanese empire, and I'll revisit that point later. China has never controlled Taiwan, and this is another interesting historical fact. China has been an empire itself through much of its history and throughout ancient history. Southeast Asian countries have historically seen China as a potential threat to their own sovereignty and freedom. In the case of Taiwan, Taiwan was only made into a province of China under the Qing dynasty for 7 years in the 19th century, and it was not a particularly valuable possession. It was ceded to Japan after the Sino-Japanese War because Japan found Taiwan useful for its own ambitions in the region, but China did not care too much for it. Taiwan was originally inhabited by indigenous population, that is the original inhabitants and owners of the land, but have faced hundreds of years of Han colonization. And in that history, after Han colonization, Taiwan was still viewed as a hinterland by China, treated as though it were to be traded off to Japan after the war as a colonial possession. But then today, for contemporary nationalism and for its own geopolitical designs, China emphasizes claims over Taiwan. This is historic. In the meantime, despite the US backing Taiwan historically, this has taken the form of the pattern of backing right-wing autocrats in the interests of anti-communism. Taiwan once faced the longest martial law period in the world under the dictatorial rule of Chiang Kai-shek and his son Chiang Ching-kuo. Taiwan democratized, but this was not willing in terms of the KMT. The US would not have allowed for this to occur without backlash against itself for backing such an authoritarian regime. But at the end of the day, Taiwan was still a geopolitical pawn. And this is also what is the case in the present. But what then caught between two empires? Taiwan has a dilemma. There is on the one hand the US, which backed the KMT for decades. The White Terror conducted led to the killing of leftists, of political dissidents, of writers, intellectuals, and just everyday people that are caught up in the sweeps in the name of anti-communism. On the other hand, then there is China, which threatens an armed invasion. China is not guiltless here. These are historic claims. Even during the course of the 20th century, there are times in which, under Mao, for example, it was suggested that China was willing to relinquish Taiwan. But now Taiwan has uncomfortably become a geopolitical flashpoint. That is because historically, this is the relation of the two sides. There are also economic means by which Taiwan is caught between the two. For example, the world's advanced semiconductors are majority produced in Taiwan. Shipping routes around Taiwan are vital to regional trade. And for the US, Asia is a very valuable market, as well as a threat in terms of China. And then in terms of the historic relation between the US and Taiwan, there's now a renewed debate about what that will take in play in the future. The US is increasingly concerned about the threat of China, and this had led to increased military activity in the Asia Pacific. With regards to its own actions domestically, one has also seen, for example, the targeting of individuals of Chinese descent with the view that they perhaps are agents of China, as in targeting, for example, Chinese scientists or individuals of Chinese descent working in science and tech-related fields in the US under the China Initiative. But then with the Pelosi visit, that provides a view in macrocosm of where, for example, the US does not have Taiwan's best interests in mind. There were reports that Pelosi sought to visit Taiwan, but that Taiwan tried to disinvite her, but it did not have the option to rule out a visit. Taiwan, of course, rolled out the red carpet for Pelosi and welcomed her. The public was quite happy with that. But then in terms of government, it puts Taiwan in an awkward position because what happens then? When China launches retaliation against the US, it will not be targeting the US, it will be targeting Taiwan. And then this talk of potential World War III on the basis of starting from Taiwan is particularly ironic, because who would it be that was caught in the line of fire, who was first in the line of fire? It would be Taiwanese people. And yet international media discourse passed over this point. The threat assessment of Taiwanese people, who have, of course, as I mentioned, faced these threats for many years, was that this was not dangerous, that these were drills. This was not a full-scale invasion. It would take months for preparation of an invasion to happen. China would have to move troops to the coasts. There'd be discussion. There would potentially be a blockade or other military actions of an intermediate nature short of a full-scale invasion. Yet, the world acted as though invasion could simply happen tomorrow at the drop of a hat. News sensation won out at the end of the day, and one saw, for example, comments by US policymakers and the military officials playing up the Chinese threat, as though, for example, an invasion could occur within the next 5 years. This proved dangerous rhetoric because of the fact that when you talk about the odds of invasion, that does make the when there's actually not such a possibility that raises the odds of an invasion. You do have the scenario in which, for example, we are moving closer to wartime, but everyone does not take this seriously. That is the boy who cried wolf too many times. At the same time, then, policymakers, whether you're talking about the US, China, or Taiwan, have an incentive to play up the military threat, to try to stimulate action, to try to push for military reform, for example, extending the draft or purchasing more arms. And that is something that I think US policymakers have increasingly leaned into. Blinken, the Secretary of State, for example, now claims that China has accelerated its timeline for an invasion, for conducting an invasion. But then when one looks at, for example, the comments of Chinese President Xi Jinping around the time of the 20th National Congress, a major political event and high-level political meetings in China, there's nothing to suggest that. So what is then, why are US policymakers playing this up? With regards to the Pelosi visit that Taiwan could not actually say no to, what was the aim of this? It was not actually to benefit Taiwan in any way. It was not to negotiate a trade deal, let's say, or even an arms agreement purchase. There's no even pretense to that. What it was to play up the Democrats as strong on China by visiting Taiwan ahead of midterm elections in the US. It shows the way in which China has become an election issue for both the Democrats and Republicans. And oftentimes then playing up support for Taiwan is a way to signify being tough on China. But in that case, one asks, well, where was that support beforehand? Why is it only that in a time of rising tensions or shortly before elections, there are all these moves thrown at Taiwan? So Taiwan is in an awkward position. Taiwan fits into the pattern of, as I mentioned, countries in which there was a right-wing autocrat backed by the US for anti-communism. Taiwan did have US Army bases in the past, and this did lead to protest. This has, however, been left as a historical memory. There are some exceptions, such as the famous Taiwanese New Wave film in 1983, The Sandwich Man, depicting, for example, when a child is run over by a US GI in a Jeep. And so these incidents occurred in Taiwan in the past to provoke protests, but US bases withdrew from Taiwan after the breaking of diplomatic relations between the ROC, the name by which Taiwan is officially known, and in favor of recognizing China, that is to say the PRC, the People's Republic of China. And one notes in the way in which historical memory has been revised. America bombed Taiwan during World War II. Firebombing razed cities in Taiwan. However, after the US came to Taiwan, this led to nostalgia, a kind of romanticization, let's say. This is proved similar to the memory of the Japanese colonial period in Taiwan. Particularly, I think, alone of many of Japan's former colonies, many Taiwanese remember Japanese rule in a positive light. This is kind of a manufactured memory. There's nostalgia that is invented because of the fact that when the KMT came over, taking control of Taiwan with the backing of the US, this made the Japanese seem better by comparison. One sees a similar phenomenon, for example, today in Hong Kong, in which British colonialism has been nostalgized and romanticized because of China now being the ruler of Hong Kong and carrying out actions that eroded the democratic freedoms. Not that those democratic freedoms actually existed in Hong Kong when the British were in power either. And so there is this fact that occurs in Taiwan, and then with the Pelosi visit is quite visible. There are strange bedfellows, particularly between the hawkish Republican right that is attempting to push harder on China and progressives in Taiwan, because it is a progressive political administration that is in power now, that emerged from the democracy movement and took power. The KMT, the former authoritarian party, is still around. It still runs in elections, which it can still win at times. And so it still remains a threat. But then one has seen a reversal in which the KMT, that was historically backed by the US as an external force and maintained rule over Taiwan, constituting a political elite that ruled over the population, who had descended from prior waves of Han migration or were indigenous, but were not the population that their descents are around 10% that came to Taiwan with the KMT after World War II and the defeat in the Chinese Civil War. Now the KMT has switched the outside power, the external power that backs it to China, arguably, in a time of rising and political power by China and economic might. The KMT has decided to trade its external backer from the US to China. And this points to a way in which empires and the history of empires dovetail. Whereas the DPP, despite historically facing down against the KMT that was supported by the US, is now depending on the US. As recently as 2012, the US sought to sabotage the DPP candidate with a claim that she was a pro-independence provocateur, and that is Tsai Ing-wen, who is currently president today. But then in terms of this kind of odd legacy, I think particularly we can point to the way that empire comes together in various odd forms. The history of empire intersects. Japan's rise was with the claim that this was Pan-Asianism, that Asia would be for Asians and Japan would be leading the way. That is how Japan justified its own empire, despite carrying out mass killings and persecutions of political dissidents or anyone that opposed its rule. And China does this largely today as well, claiming that it will oppose US empire and restore sovereignty, when that is not the case. For example, one sees ways in which China dovetails not only with the history of Japanese empire, but also US empire. The mass detention of Uyghurs in Xinjiang today, for example, uses rhetoric drawn from the US war on terror, because Uyghurs are imprisoned because of their religion. They are majority Muslim. The view is that this will make them politically dangerous to China at a time in which ethnic minorities and their separate identities are increasingly being repressed in favor of the Han majority rule. And this has led to some inaccurate perceptions, because I think particularly from the US, there are some critics of empire that cannot actually distinguish between US and Chinese empire, or their analysis puts US empire at the center of everything. And so they fail to note the convergent behavior of the US and China where this is concerned, claiming, for example, that China does only have the interests of ethnic minorities in China at mind, or other countries in the region. There's a failure to there's a mistake in projecting the dynamics of the US onto China, for example, with regards to that Han Chinese, who are a minority that has historically been oppressed in the US, are the majority in China. And so it is unsurprising that one sees racism, repression, cultural destruction outright of ethnic minorities, quote unquote, in China. And so that is one of the challenges then, how to think our way out of empire. We're at a time in which the US and China are increasingly in conflict, and countries in the Asia Pacific are caught between the two. Taiwan, though there has been a change, that there is now a progressive administration in power, is still tied to the US in this odd way, and it cannot really rid itself of that tie. On the other hand, China is no alternative because of the fact that it itself wishes to really take the place of global hegemony that the US currently has. Efforts by China to expand its power often seem to be modeled after the US, for example, constructing international institutions modeled after the IMF, or is in terms of building overseas bases. There's concern that China will utilize renting ports, for example, to do the same. And so Taiwan is caught between the two and has no clear option out. We also live in a time in which, particularly in the Asia Pacific, we see authoritarian legacies. We see, for example, Marcos Jr. being elected. When one looks across the Asia Pacific, this is a broader pattern. In South Korea, for example, just a few years ago, one had Park Geun-hye, the daughter of the former dictator, in power. The Abe political dynasty in Japan, Shinzo Abe, the former Japanese prime minister, was recently assassinated, but his family is still influential in politics. His brother is another powerful politician, is also from a political family that goes all the way back to Japanese empire. And he has always had a mission that derived from his family to restore the glory of Japanese empire, even as he is working with the US. And one sees similarly with Marcos in the Philippines or Park in South Korea. And so at a time in which the US, as it has done in the past, is backing right-wing authoritarians in the Asia Pacific in order to counter China. And Taiwan is no exception, that this could also occur potentially if the US decides that the current administration or the current political party that's in power is convenient. But then what is the way out? I think what we need to think of now is that there are, as mentioned, no easy answers. We cannot actually just bank on one empire against the other with a view that is an alternative. How do we go beyond empire entirely? And so that points to the need to think of means of transnational resistance. What can it mean to think beyond borders, to build solidarity in a way that is not simply offering solidarity from place to place, but understanding that these issues are shared and that we are all caught between this time of rising tensions between the US and China, in which the US empire and its historical legacy also has effect in terms of the shadow cast of China. China attempting to mimic, for example, the past actions of the US and the history of other empires before that, such as the Japanese empire. And so I'll close on this point, but I want to refer to the song that's I selected to choose at the end of this panel. And so it is a labor protest anthem in Taiwan. It's in fact the dominant labor protest anthem, Workers Fight Song, that's the name of the song. But when one looks at the melody, it's actually taken from a song about the Gwangju massacre in South Korea, which was the purging of students, of regular people that protested the authoritarian rule of the government at that point in time. But they were framed then as communists, as supporting North Korea. And so March for Beloved is an anthem remembering them and also vowing to struggle for the future. Though that has led to accusations, for example, from the Korean right, that the people they're praising or saying they'll fight for on behalf is in fact North Korea. That's not the case. But what's interesting to me is the afterlife of this song. This song has been picked up, for example, in Taiwan as a labor anthem. This took place after Taiwanese labor activists visited Korea in the 1980s, heard the song, were inspired, and took it back and used the melody. And they did change the lyrics to make it more about labor struggles, but it does point to this kind of connection. And in recent years, one has also heard this song in Hong Kong with regards to the struggle against China. And so I think it's interesting to look at these histories of resistance as they dovetail, as they're shared between these different places, as we consider path forward for all of us in Asia Pacific, as caught between two empires, and thinking through the history of empire to go beyond empire, rather than simply idealizing one empire against another. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian Hioe, for those very timely interventions. And we now have a little more than 20 minutes for the Q&A session. If you haven't already done so, please do feel free to post your question using the link in the chat box that will be reposted. In that chat box, there's a link to the Q&A form. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We apologize if we're not able to read your question. In the interest of time, I'll also ask panelists to please keep your responses brief. So our first question is as follows. Speaking about the experiences of activists during World War II in the US and the Philippines, Moonho Jung noted that the, quote, fundamental contradiction was never between the US and Japan. It was between empire and democracy. This clearly resonates with Nerissa Balce's analysis of empire and fascism in the Philippines, and also with what Brian Hioe is suggesting regarding the contradiction between the US and the PRC. So how can Asian people, Pacific Islanders, and Americans of Asian and Pacific descent transcend struggles among empires and nation states and turn the struggle into one for democracy and against empire? What has worked in the past? What are some future prospects? And whichever one of you wants to jump in first, but I think all three of you could potentially speak to this question.
I mean, that is such a big question, but I think one is to confront empire, to talk about empire, because, you know, in the US context, we could talk about the US empire, at least in recent memory, just for a very short amount of time, I would say, when George W. Bush, the war criminal, known as George W. Bush, waged his so-called war on terror. Like those right-wing nuts talked about the US empire, right, in a celebratory fashion. But outside of that, I think empire is not talked about, right, in US political conversation. So I think that's one way. And another, I think, is to, and it's something that I was getting at in my talk, is to really think of our identities, think of our political subjectivity beyond liberal citizenship, right? So what does it mean to think of ourselves as racialized subjects of the US empire rather than Americans or Asian Americans, right?
I love that. Thank you, Moonho. I appreciated your points. Before I answer, can we just also pause and just be happy that Lula won? And, you know, maybe Brazil is, you know, maybe Brazil under Lula is the country we have to pay attention to, you know, to think of how they are moving forward with their freedom dreams, you know. Lula had a quote that it stuck in my head. He was asked how he'll move forward as a leader, and his answer was, we refuse another Cold War. We will do business with both China and the United States. I thought that was very funny, but also very practical. And, you know, he's aware of these two countries and the power that these two countries have and the tensions. He is aware that we are living in another Cold War. So I think that I'm going back to what Moonho said, that there are no easy answers, but maybe the way to move forward is to talk about history and legacies of resistance, like this lovely event. I was so moved by Brian's presentation because when he was talking about how the Taiwanese are nostalgic about the Japanese as colonizers, I could hear my own family relatives talk about how the Second World War, the experience of the family was not really horrific. The Japanese soldiers were very pleasant and charming. They loved the orchids of my grandmother. Like, what? So I think that there has to be a way to be critical about these memories of empires and the romance that it comes with. I think that the promise of citizenship, liberal citizenship, it's a dead, it's a false fiction that we have held so much. And I think that that has been the reason why we have had these, we've had people of color siding with the violent institutions of the US empire. A lot of people of color are part of the military, are part of, they support counterinsurgency programs. Immigrants believe that counterinsurgency programs bring modernity to their countries, so we have to be critical of all this, these Trojan horses that come with colonization and our contacts with empires. But I want to move it to Brian.
Yeah, I would echo some of the points that have been previously raised, but I would also bring up that in terms of the US, for example, American politicians, their actions in the Asia Pacific are often motivated by domestic concerns. And so, for example, Lula was brought up. What was very interesting to me about that was that after the victory, Biden congratulated him, which was a signal to the right-wing fascist elite of Brazil to not try anything. And I think part of it is because there might be pushback in the US, for example, if he throws his weight behind overthrowing the government in that sense. They backed Bolsonaro. As I mentioned, the Pelosi visit was driven more by domestic concerns than they were about, for example, Taiwan's benefit or anything in the Asia Pacific, considering that would ramp up tensions. And so I think, particularly in the US, voicing this as a way to drive this point home is critical actually. But it is important to then to center local voices in Asia or elsewhere and what they think. But also add in terms of, for example, I alluded to solidarity at the end of my comments. And the question for me is, what does solidarity get us? Because oftentimes it is just exchanging words or sympathy. And that is helpful in terms of moral support or in tough times, of course. But then, for example, we don't have anything like the non-alignment movement today, thinking about ways to build power, for example, beyond the structures of two empires or a bipolar world. And I think that's a challenge to think about for the future. I mean, I don't have answers there either, but I think we do need to consider these kind of possibilities.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to a few questions, one for each panelist. So I'm going to start with a question that came in for Brian Hioe from a student from Taiwan. And that student asks, what are the Taiwanese sentiments regarding American aid in its preparation for Chinese invasion? How do Taiwanese news outlets paint the US government?
So this is actually a really interesting question because I think that, well, as probably this student does not need to be told, Taiwanese news media is very polarized between the pro-China, the KMT, and the historically pro-independence DPP, which is more backed by the US these days. And then I think particularly for most Taiwanese, there's the historic view of the US just as a benefactor, and there's not this kind of critical view. This is something that dovetails from the KMT to the DPP. Historically, the US backed the KMT, and so the KMT idealized the US in terms of its messaging and rhetoric and propaganda. And then now with the DPP in power and banking on the US, that is also continued. But then what is really, I think, wretched about the situation in Taiwan is then the critique of US empire often ends up being voiced by the KMT, the fascist former ruling authoritarian party. And so then they will criticize the US, for example, for selling Taiwan weapons that are not actually helpful, but intended just to offload weapons, or actions that put Taiwan in the line of fire, but actually do not benefit Taiwan. And so how do you have a more nuanced critique of that is not just criticizing the US in order to actually idealize China? And so I think thinking about that kind of nuance is very critical for valuing the media or views of the US and Taiwan.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Nerissa Balce. The question is, how does the drug war, so-called drug war, serve the aims of fascist repression? And I know that's a really big question, but if you can try to tackle it in just a minute or two, that would be great.
What was the question again? It was so.
Sorry.
Yeah.
How does the so-called drug war serve the aims of fascist repression? So it's big, I know.
No, it makes sense. As I tried to explain in the presentation, fascists are believers in the necessity of violence. They are also believers in the violence that will only come from their regimes. Everyone else must recognize the power of their regime. And so what has happened in the drug war is that Duterte has used this logic of authoritarianism and this need for using violence against people who are perceived as critics or as enemies of the state. Anyone considered as a threat to Filipino peace and order. And so this is very reminiscent of Marcos. You know, Marcos, the first Marcos regime instituted martial law on the basis of the threat of the Filipino communists in the early 1970s. And now the Filipino communist is no longer, well, still is, the Filipino communist resurfaced with Duterte's own language about, you know, the left being dangerous and that the Philippine police should eliminate and kill them all, you know. So a drug war is a proxy war. It is a fake war. The way an anthropologist explained it to me, she said, I should stop using the word drug war because it isn't a war. There are no two sides. There's only one side killing the others. And so it is a misleading term that has been used by autocrats like Duterte. And in the same way, Marcos used his time as a dictator to say that martial law must exist for an extended period of time because he believes that the Philippine state is threatened by Filipino communists. So communists were the enemies of the state in 1972. In 2016, it becomes drug users, criminals, etc. But it was a proxy war. It was just a war to strengthen the power and the administration of Duterte.
Thank you so much, Nerissa. That was very clear. We did have another question. I want to make a quick follow-up, even though we have another question for Moonho Jung coming up. But some folks are curious as to the use of the term fascist to describe Marcos. And I know this was something that came up in our kind of pre-panel meeting, and we talked somewhat about. So I know you have something to say about that. And if you can quickly address that question before we turn to Moonho Jung's question, that would be great.
Yes, fascism as an ideology has been studied, of course, mostly by scholars who study the history of Europe. And I think that since 2016, especially with the rise of authoritarians in the global South, and of course the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States, fascism became a word that was constantly looked up and read by everyone. So I think that fascism, I use the term fascism with intention, recognizing that there are historians who believe that it is useful to use the word to describe a leader who believes in using violence for his or her regime to remain in power. and human rights violations are necessary. They are collateral damage for as long as the country is rid of the enemies of the state. There will be purity and modernity that comes with the rule of the autocrat, but violence must be accepted by the citizens. So there are historians, I'm aware, that will, and scholars that will cringe when they hear Filipino scholars use the word fascist to mean Duterte or Marcos or Marcos Jr. But I think that, I made this joke, but I also mean it seriously. I think it's silly to think that fascism cannot grow or exist outside of Europe. It's kind of like, it's not really Champagne if it doesn't come from the region of Champagne. It's not really fascism if it doesn't come from Europe. I think that that's a silly argument. So what about capitalism? If capitalism exists everywhere, are there forms of capitalism that are not really capitalism? So I think that this anxiety about purity, the anxiety about authenticity, I don't find it useful. If artists and writers use the word fascist to describe Duterte and Marcos Jr., I will side with the writers and the activists. And so that is why I use the term fascist.
Thank you so much. Very clear, very clear. I now want to turn to a question for Moonho Jung. And the question is, did World War II and the independence of the Philippines in 1946 mark a change in US policy or just a continuation of imperialism in a new form?
No, the end of World War II did not mark the end of the US empire. Now, the Philippines was granted independence on July 4th, 1946, but I think we need to think about it in a larger context, right? So, the Philippine Commonwealth was established in 1935, supposedly a step toward independence, but it's really colonialism under a different name, right? And if you look at it within the larger context of the Asia Pacific, Japan had beaten the United States to the punch by setting up Manchukuo, right? So I think it's really helpful to think about, and I definitely alluded to this in my talk, that Japan and the United States were not polar opposites, not by any means. And so the way they justified each other's empire really reinforced and replicated the rhetoric, the institutions of the other, right? Now, there's so many odd, ironic, weird twists to this history, right? So Hukbalahap, a communist affiliated movement that emerged against Imperial Japan during World War II, actually sided with the United States during World War II. But then they became the target of anti-communism by the US state and the Philippine state, after independence or so-called independence. So no, I think it definitely continues long after the end of World War II.
Thank you so much. So I have a question for everyone, anyone who wants to address it, and that is, how can Asian countries resist US empire while they are still holding on to capitalism? And anyone who wants to address that, take a stab at that first.
I guess I could jump in. So I think it's quite interesting to think about because, for example, you have all the things like the Fukuyama notion of the end of history, that countries that are so economically intertwined will never fight each other, and this will be the end of history, quote unquote. But then in reality, that basically means Pax Americana, that America wins over American capitalism. But that is not the case then, actually. Countries can be deeply intertwined economically and still have these tensions. And I also think it's quite interesting, particularly think about US empire and, for example, despite after World War II, with the growth of the Japanese economy, there's all these visions of fighting Japan. And then you see this in, for example, Blade Runner or Cyberpunk, and this specter of Japan. But then that's absurd because you look at politically, Japan is under the US. There are US bases in Japan. What are you going to fight with? And that is the case, I think, particularly regarding countries that are under US dominion in the Asia Pacific. There's this kind of anxiety. But I think thinking one ways out of that is very difficult. I mean, in terms of geopolitical nations, the nation states like this now will probably fade and capitalism may persist. And so, but at the same time, the economic relations and the political relations, how they go fit together, that, for example, the US is trying to weave together countries in the Asia Pacific together more tightly in order to resist China through, for example, the TPP originally before Trump withdrew from it, and other kind of regional alignments like that. I think it's worth looking at that and pondering that because it's not clear what the answer is now, but this is a vitally important question to think through.
Thank you. How about Munho or Nerissa? Either of you want to chime in on this one?
I don't know if I can answer it directly, but let me take a crack at it. Lenin defined imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, right? But I'm not saying that we should take that definition as the sacred word. That's not what I'm saying. But I think we need to think about the relationship between imperialism and racial capitalism. I don't think they're definitely overlapping, but they're not one and the same, right? Now, when Lenin reconvened the Communist International, the Third International, he wanted to talk about colonialism, right? And so many people gravitated to the communist movement because it really was the political movement that wanted to talk about racism, to confront racism, to confront colonialism, right? And so the man who would become Ho Chi Minh used to talk about, when he read Marx's Capital, it just put him to sleep. It was like his pillow, right? But when he read Lenin, he started crying because for the first time he realized that there was a person thinking about leading a global movement, thinking about colonized subjects like, the Vietnamese. And so, I'm not trying to romanticize the communist movement, but definitely the 1920s, and I would say, up till the Popular Front era, it was the movement that really brought colonialism into the conversation about liberation, about freedom, right? And so I think we need to remember that history, not as a blueprint for the future, but we need to remember that history, right?
Thank you. Nerissa, do you want to chime in on this one?
I want to end with that image of Ho Chi Minh in tears while reading Lenin. I think that's beautiful. So I'm going to let the last word be Munho.
Thank you. So I have another question for any of you who want to address it. And that is, what are Asian and Pacific people entitled to expect from the US state in recognition of their histories of being subjected to US empire? In other words, does the US have a responsibility to the people of Asia and the Pacific because of its history of empire building? And if so, how might it fulfill that responsibility without deepening the imperialist impact?
It's a strange and very hopeful question, as though the United States can confront its history of imperial wars and be accountable to the descendants of those who were killed during those wars. I don't know if that's possible. It's a question that is interesting because there's something hopeful about it. And as someone who likes to show Raoul Peck's I Am Not Your Negro in all of my Asian American Studies courses, I like to begin with that documentary I remember a line from the documentary, which is about the writing of James Baldwin. And Baldwin says that, I'm going to paraphrase something beautiful that he wrote, but he said something like, there are things that are ugly that have to be confronted, and nothing will be done if it is not confronted. At the same time, he is not sure what the United States will look like once it confronts the reality of white supremacy as the very fabric and foundation of the country. So I don't know what that will look like. I don't even know if it's possible for, or maybe it is, because there are moments in the history of the United States that are moments of this reckoning of white supremacy. We saw this in 2020, with the protests in the Black Lives Matter protests. There was that brief moment when there was this confrontation with the history of, the aftermath of slavery, the reality of the United States as a carceral state. But I don't know. I don't know what it would look like, but I believe in the necessity of the confrontation, just as Baldwin said, that nothing happens if we do not confront history.
Thank you so much. Moonho or Brian, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I want. Oh, you first.
Go ahead, Brian. You go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because I do think it's quite antithetical to America. I mean, it's very hard for any Asian state to confront founding myths as foundational violences instead. But I think what is then interesting, I mean, for example, the discussion of the statues of America's history, for example. And I think that particularly for those of us in countries that have lived through authoritarian times, we'll have these statues that we're dealing with of dead dictators and so forth. And we have their children running for power again and that kind of thing. And so maybe that is a template for actually thinking through this kind of past. But then I also question to what extent you can actually get when it comes to trying to undo these founding myths, let's say. Because then I look at, for example, just the right wing flipping out about cultural Marxism in the academy. And unfortunately, I think they're the immune system of America of defending this kind of notion of America. And unfortunately, it's those of us that are trying to provoke more critical views of history that are maybe I don't know, viruses in the system. I don't know.
I can't remember the wording of the question exactly, but what can we expect from the United States? Was that a component of that question? I think more violence would be definitely one thing to expect. I think I would reword the question or to rephrase it, not that the United States will ever feel responsible, but I think it's up to us to make the United States accountable and responsible, right, for crimes against humanity. I think that's the way I would frame it. One quote that I've been saying a lot repeatedly in the wake of anti-Asian violence over the last few years is, what Martin Luther King said on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination, was that he called the US government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And in 2022, that is still the case, right? That is the US empire. And so I don't think we can expect answers or apologies from the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today.
Okay, well, thank you so much, all three of our panelists. Please join me in thanking them for their very thoughtful discussion on this extremely important topic. Please do stay tuned. We'll be playing some more music, including a portion of the Workers' Fight song by Black Hand Nakasi that Brian Hioe referenced in his remarks, followed by the music video for Us by the Filipino-American hip hop and spoken word artist Ruby Ibarra. While you are listening to those selections, please check out the document that's linked in the chat box, which includes numerous links to materials relevant to the talks you heard today supplied by the panelists. And please join us for the next Feinberg Series event on November 15th. This will be the inaugural Daniel Ellsberg Lecture delivered by the 2022 Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Azmat Khan on the human toll of America's air wars. This is a hybrid event, which will be hosted on Zoom and in the UMass Amherst Student Union Ballroom. So if you signed up to receive Feinberg Series emails, please check your email for an invitation to that event. Otherwise, please look on the Feinberg Series website for more information. Thank you all so much and have a good night, or if you are in Asia, a great day.